Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought it would be a good time to circle back and talk a little bit about Pakistan and India, and maybe take a look at what's going on with China too. India seems to be sort of wedged in between the two of those, and Pakistan and China have a nice alliance going. China is doing some stuff there in Pakistan, but Jim, the last couple of days things flared up in Pakistan. India lost a plane. What's that all about?
Well, what it is something that's been going on for over a year. The Pakistani military has been, how should I put it, carrying out a different kind of coup. About half the time since Pakistan became independent, same time as India, in the late 40s, the government has been ruled by a military government that took over, for the good of the country, and then under pressure eventually allowed elections. Since 2011, that's when the Americans went in and got Osama bin Laden, who had been living in plain sight in in what was described as a Pakistani military city. It's where many of their facilities, including their equivalent of West Point, is located. And that was hugely embarrassing for the military because they were caught flat-footed. They were warned, obviously, and the commandos were in and out before the Pakistani military had any idea what was going on. The documents that came out of that indicated that the Pakistani military was indeed aware of Osama bin Laden, having sanctuary in one of their military bastions, as it were. And the military were not happy about this. There was a lot of other embarrassments. And suddenly, staging a coup was no longer as much of an option. In other words, in the past, the Pakistani military had been able to get a certain amount of public support for their takeovers because, the corruption is bad in Pakistan. It's hard to say who's worse, Pakistan or India. They're both in very bad shape in terms of political corruption. But the Pakistani military is a far more corrupt institution than their Indian counterpart. It's something that doesn't get covered much. When the two countries became independent, there were two major differences between how they set up their government. India went out of their way to eliminate the feudalism. They literally bought out a lot of the feudal landowners and distributed, much of the land, to farmers. Land distribution sounds very communistic, but they remained a democracy, although a very socialist one. But they also instituted, how should I put it, strict rules in the Constitution and in fact about the military and political, balance. In other words, the Indian military was always, there was never any doubt, subordinate to the civilian government. It was not the case in Pakistan. Pakistan did not eliminate the feudalism, so power was concentrated in a relatively small number of families. And the Pakistani military was, how should I put it, their political power grew unchecked to the point now where we, among other people, describe the Pakistani military or Pakistan as an army with a country attached. That's not unusual, but it rarely ends well. And on top of that, the Pakistani military in the late 1970s, desperate for, how should I put it, some way to hang on to power, decided to do two things. One, they would create India as a permanent threat to Pakistan, whether India was actually that or not, and it actually wasn't. Secondly, they would use what we tend to call these days asymmetric warfare. They would adopt Islamic militarism, Islamic terrorism, in effect, and sponsor Islamic terrorist organizations and give them sanctuary in Pakistan if they would attack India. The main focus of this was Kashmir. When the two countries separated, there was a dispute over who should own Kashmir. Legally, technically, let's say India, it belonged to India because the rule was if the head of the if the pre you know independence head of the the old pre-colonial state, as it were, was a Hindu, then the state was Hindu. If he was Muslim, then the state was Muslim. Kashmir, there was a dispute. Most of the population, a little over half, was Muslim, but the leaders were Hindu. Um, and India immediately took it all. Pakistan invaded, and well, they still they don't own half of it, but they owned about over a third of it, and not the best part of it. But anyway, that's been a festering wound ever since. Even though India is much more powerful, Pakistan persists in basically maintaining a state of war, undeclared war, which occasionally becomes a declared war, which Pakistan loses with India. Now, most Pakistanis have over the decades, even though the majority of Pakistanis support Pakistani claims on Kashmir, they admit that their own military has been basically running a con on the Pakistani people and the Pakistani government. The Pakistani military, is let me put it this way: there are six times as many people in India as in Pakistan. The economic disparity is even greater, as is the amount of money spent on military, the military budget. And ever since 2001, nearly 20% of the Pakistani military budget has been subsidized paid for by the United States military aid, which is now cut off because increasingly over the last since before 2011, the United States and the neighboring countries of Pakistan and Afghanistan have accused Pakistan of sponsoring this terrorism. The Pakistanis created the Taliban in the mid 1990s to basically have a faction fighting in the Afghan civil war, and the Taliban were still attempting to conquer the entire country of Afghanistan when 2001 occurred, and we know how that all turned out. And the Pakistanis military has never backed off from this. Now they are condemned. I mean, the condemnations are basically the majority of the UN. The UN is basically saying, Pakistan, stop it. You're basically a international pariah for this. But because they have Russia and China as allies, they have two vetoes in the Security Council, which block any serious UN measures against them. Now, we've cut off their aid. They are basically trying to blackmail the United States by saying, well, we'll cut off, land, the truck access to Afghanistan because Afghanistan is landlocked. But that no longer works, well, more or less, because there's a new landline of railroads and road and a new port in Iran. So there's another way in. Now, India paid for much of this Iranian connection. The Iranians have been trying to establish good relations with Pakistan, and they normally have, but now the Pakistanis have basically thrown in with the Saudis because the Saudis have more money. And the Saudis have been subsidizing Pakistan for a long time, especially since the price of oil shot up in the 1970s. And Pakistanis realize, they're mainly Sunnis, and the Iranians are mainly Shia. There's a religious dictatorship in Iran, which is unpopular with most Iranians now. Maybe they better side with Saudi Arabia. They maintain fairly good relations with Iran, but they're not buddies with Iran. And Iran is literally using this new corridor into Afghanistan, which the United States accepted, from the sanctions. as basically a major trading a source of income because it opens up not only trade with Afghanistan, but also with Central Asia. Um, so this is a big deal for Iran, no matter who's running the government. Now, the problem is that for centuries, the major pathway, land route into Afghanistan is through the Khyber Pass. That's the main crossing, and another one down in Helmand, where most of the heroin is grown. That's one of the reasons why there's so much heroin grown down there. It's easy to smuggle it out with bribes to the Pakistani security forces and get it into the Karachi and onto a ship or an airplane, and off we go. So you have a situation where Pakistan is basically an outlaw state, using their own force, as it were, of Islamic terrorist organizations. And the military has increased its political power without taking over the government. They're doing it with terror. I mean, we cover it regularly in strategy page, but they've terrorized many of the judges, but not all of them. They've terrorized the mass media, including Facebook, which apparently isn't that hard to terrorize. And they've basically gotten Facebook, for example, and Google to shut down anybody the Pakistani military complains about is saying nasty things about them. Now, a lot of those nasty things happen to be true about the kidnappings and the murders and the intimidation plots and tactics. But the fact is, they've learned that from the Chinese. You could basically get the Western media to back off and to stop, doing a lot of damage internally by just simply letting the news spread. Fortunately, there are other, how should I put it, news outlets on the internet, and the news does get around inside Pakistan. So Pakistan, although they are stronger, the military has more political power now than they have ever had in the past without actually running the government. They are more unpopular. The only thing that's keeping them alive is not the Chinese, but it's that the how should I put it, the minority, the militant minority of Muslims they've created this other monster in their midst, who is willing to basically impose Sharia law, all sorts of nasty stuff, which occasionally pops up into the news. And nobody can do anything about it. Now, the Chinese are in a strange situation here. They are using Pakistan as a main trunk line for their One Belt, One Road, or whatever the Belt and Road Initiative. They keep changing their name. But anyway, they have a major railroad, and pipeline, and fiber optic line connection going down into Pakistan and into a new port, which has been built down by the Iranian border, mainly for China's benefit. They have close to 500,000 Chinese working in Pakistan. The Pakistani military has basically formed a special unit, a corps-sized unit, whose only job is to assure the safety of Chinese in Pakistan. The Chinese Pakistan are major targets, but the Islamic terrorists have been ordered, the internal, the government-sponsored terrorists, but you lay off. Chinese are off limits. So they only have to worry about the rogue Islamic terrorist units, which have always, long before the 1970s, been attacking other Muslims who they feel are heretics or not their type of Muslim. It's a very violent situation, religion-wise, in Pakistan, much more so than in India. And the Chinese have basically told the Pakistanis, there's going to be two differences with the way we operate versus the Americans. One, we'll pull out. We're not going to play any games with you supporting Islamic terrorism against us. It will not happen. And remarkably, it hasn't. You see, secondly, we don't give you money. We loan you money, and we expect payback, which is a big difference from the Americans, who basically gave them $30 billion over the years. And the Chinese basically don't mess around. They basically have reestablished the imperial form of government, which was one strong man who serves for life. That's Mr. Xi, who is currently in power. he considers himself a new Mao Zedong, which is not a big comforting thought. And the Pakistanis respect this. They said, okay, no freebies, good technology, but not as good as the Americans were giving us. And we got to control our own Islamic terrorists who love to attack, many of whom love to attack Chinese, and we'll show them we can do it, which is ironic because Pakistan shows that they can control Islamic terrorism if they want to. But in terms of sponsoring attacks in India and Afghanistan, they do not want to. And this is something the majority of the neighbors, well, the majority of the world and the UN, they've officially acknowledged. But nobody can do anything about it because they're protected by Russia and especially by China. So there's a situation, a heavily armed slum.
Austin?
Well, Jim gave a great rundown on the history. Let me point out a couple of things about 1947 when the separation occurred. And I want to say it was 6-7 years ago, I wrote an article that ran in the Weekly Standard about the separation of the division of British India into India and Pakistan, West and East Pakistan. East Pakistan is now Bangladesh, result of the 1971 Indo-Pakistani War. I argued that that division was one of the greatest geopolitical mistakes of the 20th century. Now, I had thought that for a number of reasons, but there are, I won't say they are a majority, they aren't, but there are a number of Pakistani intellectuals and degreed technical experts who have studied in the West here in the United States among them, and this is where I spoke to some about this several years ago, who have come to the conclusion that it was a mistake as well. There were a lot of Hindus and Muslims at the time that asked themselves, why are we doing this? Now, the biggest reason, one of the biggest reasons, was the leader of the Muslim League, Ali Jinnah, made the claim that Muslims will never prosper under a Hindu regime. And as Jim just told you, that's flat not true. Doesn't India still have the largest Muslim population in the world, comparable to Indonesia's, or just it's smaller? Smaller.
They have more than Pakistan, and they are much less Islamic terrorism among their Muslim population.
Yeah,
that's very telling.
I was looking at absolute numbers. It's comparable to Indonesia. In other words, a huge Muslim population, and they are doing far better as a group than the Muslims in Pakistan and Bangladesh as well. Even though Bangladesh, Muslim Indians and Bengalis, many of them, and they're an ally of India. And maybe they're a creature of India in some ways, but they are function as an ally of India, not an enemy. Anyway, to get back to the thinking of this new generation of Pakistanis, it's why do we fight the Indians? We really speak the same language, Hindi and Urdu. Yeah, there's some variations on it. There's some more now than there were in the late 1940s, but they're basically the same language. They also speak English. English is widely spoken, at least in the what I'll call the more urban and settled areas of Pakistan. The tribal territories are another problem, which is another reason a lot of Pakistanis think that the dividing India hurt Pakistan more than hurt Pakistan a lot, is that it lost the strategic depth of India of dealing with the hill tribes. now that you have to, and there's many of those, as Jim was saying, many of those tribes are religious radicals. That's one of the interior issues in Pakistan that doesn't stay interior. One other thing I'll touch on about it. Do I think it's possible to reconstitute India was essentially the British India that existed? No, not now. But again, it would be interesting if the Pakistani military continues on the destructive path that has been on really for the last 30 years. You may have a demand in rising out of Pakistan eventually saying, let's stop this. Now, let's end the antagonism. But enter China. China has an interest in keeping the antagonism going. The antagonism between Pakistan and India distracts India. And the Sino-Indian War of 1962 isn't over. This is something we've touched on in strategy talks 3 or 4 times, and I think Jim and I did a strategy talk on Indian and Chinese territorial claims. It was quite some time ago. But they still shoot at each other way up there in the Himalayas. And the Indians are still rankled that the Chinese got the jump on them in 1962 and really took the controlling points of some of the major passes going south, particularly in the eastern sector. The Chinese have, as Jim said, poured money, done into Pakistan construction, like the huge port Gadar. That's one way it's spelled Gawdar. In some places you'll see it Gaidar, but it's a port complex, and it's a commercial port complex, according to the Pakistanis and the Chinese. But as the Indians point out, it's 98% of the facilities will be in place to support a Chinese Navy if the Chinese Navy decided to take up permanent operations in the Indian Ocean. So the division and the instability has now got a emerging global power on the side of Pakistan to keep the pot boiling, I guess is the way I want to say it. Could this war go nuclear? Interestingly enough, and I saw this on YouTube a couple of days ago, there was a senior Pakistani official. He said he was addressing the people of India, saying, "Can't we keep this cool? We have nuclear weapons, and you have nuclear weapons. Well, let's keep it cool." But remember, what set off this latest clash was an attack that killed, what was it, Jim, 40 soldiers? Yeah, it's right in that. When I first report I read, it was in the high 30s, and then it was over 40. Most of them Indian soldiers, some other security personnel, and civilians. An outright attack by Islamist terrorists, and again they are supported. Jim made this point by elements of the Pakistani military who use Kashmir as a political tool for galvanizing public support. And therefore the Indians say, we're not going to accept an attack of that size without striking back. And then it's escalated to the point of supposedly 2 Indian aircraft were shot down about 2 days ago. As we record this, there's evidence of one being shot down, the parts of a MiG-21 in Pakistan's slice of Kashmir. I haven't read any place about what the Pakistani aircraft were. They're probably F-16s. If they were F-16s, it's another advertisement for American aircraft. But the fact that India and Pakistan are shooting at one another is bodes ill for for the immediate future. Could they start shooting at each other conventionally? They already have. Artillery duels have broken out. They're reminiscent of what was called the Kargil War that has flickered on and off since, I want to say, 1999.
Yeah, it was 99.
Yeah, it was 1999. Look back that the number of the 65 Indo-Pakistani War was quite serious. We're living with the results of the 1971 Indo-Pakistani War, where India ultimately invaded East Pakistan and Bangladesh emerged. Jim, I need to check on this. There was one Muslim-ruled enclave that it was overwhelmingly Hindu in the people that ended up being part of India. It was really, really tiny, but the Pakistanis still make a big deal out of that politically, saying, well, if you claim Kashmir because it had a Hindu ruler, about a third of the population is Hindu, and the other 2/3 was Muslim. But the other one was tiny. Kashmir is huge.
Yeah,
and that's the
plus Kashmir is full of Hindu shrines.
Absolutely,
it's one. You got to remember that the Ganges River, most of the southeastern Pakistan, is a holy area for Hindus, because that's where Hinduism is considered to have been arisen, as it were, and flourished in its various golden ages. The Muslims, Timur and what have you, the various invasions, they managed to convert a lot of Indians, usually at sword point, to Islam, and that was resented. Now, it was a cause of friction between Muslims in general and India, because unlike most of their other conquests, like Iran, which was quickly converted, as it were, to Islam, the majority of Indians did not convert. I mean, they resisted. The Muslim rulers in India were never able to conquer the entire country. In fact, that's one reason why India was Britain was so successful in basically unifying the whole country. They were a dominant, superior military power and diplomatic power, and they were outsiders. And although the Indians and Pakistanis, it won't take too much encouragement to curse out the Indian, colonialism, they do accept the fact that they gave them a common language, which was not a political football. In other words, English is generally acknowledged. In fact, there are now more English speakers in India than any other country in the world. Another distinction they have. And also, India had the Industrial Revolution imposed on them by the British. That's why they have a railway system and a lot of modern industry. But the colonialism was rough. The British did not mess around, but they basically used the same techniques the Romans did. They were foreign invaders, but they brought better government than the native rulers, as it were, and that's something that the post colonial governments have never been able to attain, and it's something they was talked about quietly in out of public view in India and Pakistan, that basically the existing corruption Raj, as they call it in India, the ancient customs of corruption are what's really holding India and Pakistan back, and not any after effects of colonialism. In fact, that you wouldn't have the world's largest functioning democracy in India if it weren't for the colonialism, because it provided a non controversial common language, and just as Latin did in many parts of Europe up until about 200 years ago. And it also provided technology, which when the British left was accepted. They did not go burn down the railroads and shut down the factories. They realized, hey, this stuff has benefit. Let's have more of it. Unfortunately, the Indians adopted socialism, and it took them a few decades to realize, this really doesn't work. I mean, when India kicked it out, in the 80s, the Indian critics of socialism said to the politicians, look, the Brits even though made it work, and then of course with communism, by the time communism collapsed, the Indians said, all right, end of the socialist experiment, and their economy got off to a growth spurt which had never experienced before. But the Chinese were ahead of them. Even though China is still a communist police state, they realized before India did that socialism doesn't work, and they adopted a free market economy, which has made them the second largest economy in the world in less than in about 30 years. The Indians still talk about, hey, we can basically beat the Chinese, but they can't because they are more corrupt than China. Same in India. For example, big difference between India and China or South Asia is that in India and Pakistan, the educational system is corrupt. In other words, teaching jobs are considered political patronage. There are in many cases their jobs you simply get for being a loyal supporter of the local political party. You don't have to be a qualified teacher. You don't even have to show up for work much of the time. So education in India and Pakistan for the majority of people is basically private schools, which are not that expensive, but given the poor state of the economy because of the the decades of socialist experimentation, in other words, letting the government run everything, there's not a lot of money to to spread around. So there are problems here which are part and parcel of the local culture, the corruption, the how should I put it, the tendency towards a very strong military. That was always a problem in pre-colonial India, and one reason why there was no effective opposition to the British, because there was no democracy. These were all principalities, as it were, where the generals and the nobles, basically were constantly Game of Throning each other to the death. And the British, although a monarchy, they were a constitutional monarchy, and they basically taught the Indians, this is how you do it. And basically, the Indians said, yeah, let's get rid of the aristocracy completely. But they basically did it much more effectively than Pakistan did. But they still have the problems of the corruption, and that is basically what is hurting them more than the Chinese or anything else. And we cover that regularly in strategy page and how progress is or is not happening. But the Chinese are taking full advantage of this. They realize exactly how and why the Indians are weak economically and militarily. The corruption affects the military, not so much in terms of buying and selling promotions and things like that, but the procurement system. It's devastating how bad it is, and the government keeps trying to add more layers of bureaucracy to halt corruption, but that just creates more of it. And it literally takes a decade to buy new weapon systems, even longer if it's a foreign system. And in the meantime, the military is saying, look, we're dying here literally because we haven't got modern equipment. And that's an epic, tragedy in India, which doesn't get much, play in the West. It's a similar situation in Pakistan, but the Pakistani military is literally a separate political power in Pakistan. And they can basically get whatever they can hustle out of some other country. The elected government won't oppose the military, and the Pakistani military has a much larger proportion of the national budget than the Indian military does, and a lot more power. And that's what you see playing out there. The Pakistani military is creating this tension, which they do not want to escalate into a nuclear war. Then it's all over. Everybody realizes that, which is why this thing escalated. I mean, it's not the first time the Indians have attacked inside, India, Pakistani Kashmir because of terrorism. The last time they did it was with a commando raid, which was successful in basically wiping out a camp close to the base where Pakistani trained Islamic terrorists were preparing to come across the border, sneak across the border. But the Pakistanis immediately moved more forces to the border to make it more difficult to carry out a surprise attack like that. Then the Indians started, literally, they've been doing it for months, practicing a surgical strike with aircraft. Now, it's still unclear if they actually carried that out. There are dozens of identified from commercial satellite photography, terrorist camps in Pakistan, Kashmir. So it's no secret where the targets are. So give a couple of weeks, and commercial satellite photos will come out showing, if any of them received as much damage as the Indians say they inflicted. But the Pakistanis had to respond, but not too much. They cannot afford a conventional war because they've lost every one they have fought with India. And as Austin pointed out, the one in 1999, it almost escalated. I mean, India was moving its larger armed forces to the border, and when Musharraf, who later staged a coup after that, backed off because he realized we're losing and we'll lose bigger if we keep it up. So that's one lesson the Pakistani military has learned, but they have not stopped using their brinksmanship and their use of terror to basically distract the Pakistani people from the real enemy, which is the military itself.
Jim, that's a good memory of 1999 Kargil conflict, because the Indians started moving, and it was noticed at least a mechanized corps towards the line of control. I don't know how close it actually came, but they were moving.
No, they were right on the border.
All right, so they brought it up. I know. Well, some of the units I know were deeper, were located deeper back in India. They started bringing it up, which is a very serious statement of intent. Let me make a couple of comments though about the corruption. Yes, the Indians know the corruption holds them back, and there is deep political disenchantment with that. They doesn't mean it's going to cure it. You said something about taking 10 years to get something through that acquisition system. The military over there, and I get this out of reading, sometimes reading it straight, but not between the lines in some of the Indian publications that I look at it. They're screaming about it because they see the threat that China poses. And this is covered on strategy page. Jim works that into it. The military, matter of fact, just spoke about how upset the military is with the acquisition system imposed on it by the government. One other quick comment about the Indian military: they have got some absolutely superb soldiers. They've really managed to maintain the tradition of the old so-called British Indian Army. It was really the Indian Army is what it was called, but in World War II, most World War II histories, you'll see it called the British Indian Army. Pakistan has as well. But the Indians, the Indians have maintained it, and they stand up and say, "Look, we beat the Japanese. We fought Africa Corps. Our soldiers fought their way up the Italian peninsula. We punched First World forces, and they did. Trained with British military training methods." So there is this also, for all the anger at British colonialism. Jim touched on this. There's an appreciation of it, and as the folks who were around in 47, 50, 55 pass away, younger generation kind of delights that they speak, they call it INGLISH, English.
Yeah.
And no, it's a great pun. It's a great pun.
I know.
And they, I first encountered it 40 years ago. from an Indian fellow who's a graduate student here in the States, but like English, and it's great, and they've got their own patois and slang that's developed over the years, but it acts as a bonding force within India because there are all kinds of local dialects, and not everybody even speaks Hindi. By the way, I know this is an obscurity. I did manage. I thought I've got to remember the name of that Muslim-ruled state, and it was. I'm going to take a shot at it. The princely state of Junagadh is very, very tiny, and it actually decided to join India, huge Hindu majority, and with a Muslim ruler, but it didn't go the way it was, as Jim said, the division was supposed to go. If you had a Muslim ruler, you were Pakistan. Hindu ruler, you were India. And just because this tiny little place didn't go the way it was supposed to, it's still used as a burning political ember by the Pakistani radicals. So Junagadh. I did remember it. It shows up in trivia contests about. I'm joking about the Indo-Pakistani division. There are no trivia contests on it, but. That was the exception to it. Dan, I feel like I ought to add that one of the forces that wants more contact with the U.S. military is the Indian military. They've been working with the Australians. They work with the Singaporeans because they see Singapore and Australia as fellow colonial victims of Great Britain. That's the way it was at one time. Singapore's air forces train frequently on Indian air training areas or Indian military training areas. They don't have any space. They go up and they operate in India. And now, since 2007, that quadrilateral strategic dialogue, the Quad, has emerged. Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. And that's a response to China. Poor India may be the tortoise and China the hare, and that is the way some Indian writers have talked about it. China's the rabbit, the hare that's running away in the race, and we're just this slow-moving tortoise. But they say that some of the strengths we've got is that we really do have an open society. You're not going to be thrown in jail for reading the Wall Street Journal or the Economist. You're not going to be thrown in jail for reading most anything. You might be thrown in jail if you would be if you threaten to assassinate a leader. A speech like that gets you in jail in the United States. But it's in terms of information, it's information free. They've also seen how that English is such a value. Look at Bangalore and some of the other Indian high-tech operations. It's global tech companies have technicians that you call. You have some trouble with your computer there in Utah or in Pennsylvania, end up with someone from India or the Philippines. Same thing, Philippines with a lot of English speakers. They've seen this, that produces well-paying jobs. They're also prestigious, and there's a U.S. connection. Now, what's interesting about the Quad, and we've talked about it before, if it's a quince and Singapore's in it, 4 of them in there are British colonies, aren't they? The U.S., Singapore, Australia, and India. Japan's not, but Japan had about 8 or 9 years of being kind of an American satrap. They're all threatened by China. And as I said, the way I see a lot of what goes on between India and Pakistan now, Primarily, yes, the Pakistan military part of it has an interest in keeping things stirred up. But behind it is China, which has a great interest in keeping the Indian tortoise distracted with Pakistan, because I think the Chinese are very, very concerned about what India is going to do or could do, and looks like it's going to do if it becomes a quasi-military ally of the United States and Japan. So I'll leave it with that, unless Jim's got some reaction to it.
No, that about sums it up. Paranoia all around.
All right, well, we'll end it there, and we'll talk to you gentlemen next time.
Till then, bye-bye.
Bye.